Jesus' first followers were in shock on that Sunday after his crucifixion. The unthinkable had happened. Their lives had changed so quickly from that Thursday evening to Friday afternoon. By Sunday evening, most of Jesus' closest friends, it was a much larger group than just the 12 anyway. They had gathered back in the upper room in Jerusalem where they had settled the night before for the Passover. Having scattered when soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the garden, they were back together, but everything had changed. Rome was skilled at dealing death to any threat to the way things work. Empowered by an angry mob calling for his death, Pontius Pilate ordered his soldiers to publicly torture and kill Jesus. The reality we proclaim on Easter is that Jesus really and truly died and was later resurrected, not resuscitated, but resurrected to never die again. During these Easter videos, I will consider some of the arguments made over time about the cross and resurrection. An example of these ways of explaining the Easter event is that some skeptics have made arguments over the centuries about the disciples creating the story or perhaps being deluded. All of this to keep the ministry going. They had just lost their leader. So the idea is they made up the resurrection story to explain how he could still be the Messiah even after an ignominious death. Yet we can see that while the disciples might have told a lie to keep the Jesus myth going, not once it came at the price of their lives, though. They might lie to keep it going if it meant money in their purses, but when persecution came, would they back away from claims of Jesus' resurrection? Or had it been a delusion, mass hysteria fed by a desire for the resurrection to be real? Maybe they felt that Jesus was somehow still present with them and they wished it into a historic fact. Or maybe they talked about the ways Jesus continued to be present with them even after he died. And then later believers took that story and they saw it as if Jesus had been bodily resurrected. A symbolic event could have been confused as being a historic event by people generations later. So these are some other approaches to Easter, and there's an underlying assumption that the disciples had to explain Jesus' death for the movement to continue. And it was a real issue because, as Paul would write in the church to Corinth, proclaiming Christ crucified is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The resurrection of Jesus really isn't a particularly convenient story for them to have told, as no one expected the Messiah to die and be resurrected. Oh, some of the prophets could certainly be read that way once we had eyes to see, but that God's anointed one would die was inconceivable from the way the prophets were read at the time that Jesus was born. The disciples told the story because it was so life-changingly unexpected that they could not avoid talking about it. It would have been easier if they had just claimed that Jesus' message was still valid, his teaching could live on, but it's not what they said. The apostles claimed that Jesus was and is the firstborn of the dead, the until now irrepeatable example of the resurrection. Why? Because that's what they experienced. They saw it together. This inconvenient story rounds out Jesus' inconvenient ministry. He was never a convenient Messiah, never what people expected. Scripture reveals that many people saw in Jesus the hoped-for overthrow of Rome, really military conquering. Despite the expectation of others, Jesus never tried to establish a kingdom without an earthly kingdom, that is, with an army and a palace. Jesus was establishing the kingdom within you, within me. The occupying forces he sought to overtake exist within the human heart. Jesus had summed up his whole life and ministry with the word love, saying we're to love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. Love was the heart of Jesus' inconvenient ministry. The cost of love for Jesus was death on a cross, and even then, he would not give up on that love that he had for all creation. Jesus' resurrection represents the triumph of his inconvenient ministry. 3 days later, God confirmed that love is more powerful than hate and stronger than death in raising Jesus from the dead. Those who followed Jesus had found forgiveness, healing, and love even after his ascension. Of course, that our world has trouble adjusting to a story like that. If the triumph of love and life over hate and death were a convenient story, one that fit neatly into the narratives of our world, one that the disciples could have used easily, well, we really wouldn't have needed Jesus to come in the first place. In our next video, I'll look at why Jesus died. But as we conclude this video, I note that the resurrection transformed the movement. Jesus' followers grew exponentially in number as the devastated and confused apostles were not the only ones to experience the resurrection. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read how the 12 were surprised to see others like Saul, of all people, the persecutor of the faithful, had an experience of Jesus that was so like their own. And his ministry began to bear fruit, that they could see that, whoa, God could take Saul, rename him Paul, and send him out to bring others to Christ. It was amazing. The Jesus movement continues millennia later because Jesus' followers still feel God's presence, Jesus with us, right here, right now.